Welcome everyone to History Gone Wilder, part of Half History Will Travel. I'm your host, Wilder historian Dr. Lucas Wilder, and last time we joined Hardee at Shiloh, Perryville, and Stones River. Now we travel with Hardee to Mississippi and away from the Army of Tennessee. If you like what I do, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already, join the Patreon page, and purchase something from one of my online stores. Every little bit helps. Thank you. William Hardee moved his troops to Wartrace, Tennessee in preparation to throw back a Union advance through Hoover's Gap in April 1863, but the advance didn't materialize. Near Wartrace, he set up his headquarters at Beech Grove. His daughters, Anna and Sally, stayed with him, being the first time that his family lived with him for any extended period of time during the war. While at Beech Grove, he kept up his flirtations with the local women. Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Freemantle from Britain's Coldstream Guards remembered hearing about an incident between Hardee and the ladies. Hardee has the character of being a great admirer of the fair sex. During the Kentucky campaign, he was in the habit of availing himself of the privilege of his rank and years, and insisted upon kissing the wives and daughters of all the Kentucky farmers. And although he is supposed to have converted many of the ladies to the Southern cause, yet in many instances their male relatives remained either neutral or undecided. On one occasion, General Hardee had conferred the accolade upon a very pretty Kentuckian to their mutual satisfaction, when, to his intense disgust, the proprietor produced two very ugly old females, saying, "Now then, General, if you must kiss any, you must kiss them all round," which the discomfited general was forced to do, to the amusement of his officers. In June, Union General William S. Rosecrans and the Army of the Cumberland began their advance toward the Confederate positions at Shelbyville, Wartrace, Hoover's Gap, Liberty Gap, and Tullahoma, forcing the Confederate Army commander Braxton Bragg to retreat all the way to Chattanooga, Tennessee. At Chattanooga, Hardee received orders from the Confederate War Department, sending him to Mississippi to help Joseph E. Johnston. As Rosecrans moved on the Army of Tennessee, Ulysses S. Grant captured Vicksburg, Mississippi, leaving only a small rebel force in the entire state, that under Johnston. The War Department couldn't send Johnston any more troops, but they could send him an experienced commander to help him, Hardee. Hardee arrived in Morton, Mississippi on July 19th and wrote, "Johnston has now a little over 18,000 effective infantry. I would not like to say what I thought of the organization, discipline, and general efficiency of his command. I fear I will not be able to do as much good as you anticipated. I know I wish I were back at Chattanooga with my corps. I don't think Johnston knows exactly what to do with me. He seemed glad to see me, but my status is not determined." That feeling of uncertainty never left Hardee in Mississippi. Johnston considered creating two corps and giving Hardee control of one of them. Then he thought he might make Hardee his second command. He hadn't decided on either one before he left to examine the defenses of Mobile, leaving Hardee in charge of the forces in Mississippi. Hardee used his cavalry to round up deserters, but Johnston soon returned, and Hardee was left with very little to do. Hardee wrote to a friend that, "I have become idle and worthless." Finally, the War Department gave him an assignment, to assemble and train all the paroled soldiers from Vicksburg until they could be formally exchanged and returned to combat. Many had already been assembling at Demopolis, Alabama, and knowing that they were disheartened, Hardee attempted to lift their spirits. He issued this to his command: "In anticipation that you will soon be exchanged, the work of reorganization must proceed with energy. Soldiers, look to your country. The earth ravaged, property carried away, or disappearing in flames and ashes. The people murdered, the blacks arrayed against the whites. Cruel indignities inflicted upon women and children. Destruction marks the path of our invaders. Their motto is woe to the conquered. He who falters in this hour of his country's peril is a wretch who would compound for the mere boon of life robbed of all that makes life tolerable. Fellow soldiers, there is but one path to follow. It leads to the camp. Come to your colors and stand beside your comrades." Instead of assembling the rest of the parolees at Demopolis, Hardee set up his headquarters at Enterprise, Mississippi, where the rest of the parolees would come together. Hardee attended a review of Carter Stevenson's troops at Demopolis in September. It was there he met Mary Foreman Lewis. He was immediately smitten by her, even writing to one of the other ladies in his life that, with respect to one of them at least, you have lost your chances. Since his disappointment, he is determined to concentrate his forces and attack in another quarter. See what you have lost. If a forced reconnaissance which he intends to make on Thursday next, near Demopolis, shall prove successful, he intends to bring on a serious engagement immediately. He would stay in contact with Mary from a distance. President Davis came to see about the conditions of the parolees and found that Hardee was correct in his reports. It was nearly impossible to compel them to assemble, and when they did, their spirits were nearly impossible to lift. Davis decided to send Hardee back to the Army of Tennessee, where he was sorely needed. It wasn't anything that Hardee did or didn't do with the parolees that led to his transfer. Davis needed someone with Bragg at Chattanooga. Discontent between Bragg and his subordinates following the Confederate victory at the Battle of Chickamauga led Davis to remove Leonidas Polk from that army and send him to Mississippi in hope that Hardee could help the situation within the army. On his way to Chattanooga, a newspaper reporter spoke with Hardee and had this to say: "Hardee is plain, unassuming, and domestic, takes things coolly until aroused, and then becomes a perfect lion. There is not a warmer or more congenial nature in the army. The humblest private may approach him and be assured of a ready ear. He has a frank, open face, fine blue eyes, and is just gray-haired enough and bearded enough to make one voluntarily venerate his many years of usefulness and experience." Hardee was a unique choice to calm tensions in the Army of Tennessee. Hardee was one of Bragg's biggest critics and had instigated a lot of criticism following the Battle of Perryville, but the president believed the Honorable Hardee would rise above personal animosity and help the Confederacy win victories despite his personal misgivings, and he was right. Hardee arrived at Chattanooga on October 31st, 1863, and soon after arriving, he and James Longstreet and John C. Breckinridge, the three corps commanders under Bragg, examined the landscape around Chattanooga from atop Lookout Mountain. The Union had just secured Lookout Valley and made sure the Cracker Line could keep the army in Chattanooga fed. The Confederacy possessed control of Lookout Mountain, Missionary Ridge, and the valley in between. Not only was the Army of Tennessee facing the Army of the Cumberland, its longtime foe, now it was facing the Army of the Tennessee, which had captured Vicksburg, now under William T. Sherman, and two corps from the Army of the Potomac under Joseph Hooker. All of these armies and parts of armies were now controlled by Ulysses S. Grant, a man Hardee hadn't faced in battle since Shiloh a year and a half earlier. It was now late November, and Hardee had been working on strengthening his position on Missionary Ridge, as brigade after brigade of the Army of the Tennessee began moving toward his right flank. While he and his loyal friend and subordinate Patrick Cleburne were on Missionary Ridge, they heard artillery and rifle fire coming from Lookout Mountain. When the clouds lifted, they saw the United States colors flying over the mountain. The far left flank of the Army of Tennessee had fallen. Now all the army had was Missionary Ridge. Hardee met with Breckinridge and Bragg and discussed their next steps. Longstreet had been sent into East Tennessee with his corps and an additional division to oust Ambrose Burnside from that region. Hardee advocated for withdrawing from the ridge and taking up a defensive position further south. Breckinridge claimed that if they couldn't defend this position, they couldn't defend any position, and Bragg agreed. They would stay and fight. On November 25th, the Army of the Tennessee under Sherman began battering Hardee's right flank, held by Cleburne. Hardee left that sector in the capable hands of his subordinate, while he took care of his own left, personally placing artillery to combat the approaching enemy in the form of the Army of the Cumberland, which had come out of its entrenchments around Chattanooga and launched their own attack. The rebels on the front line began to retreat up the ridge, with the Federals running after them. Hardee could hear the heavy fighting on the Army's left flank, and soon found that Cheatham's division was now facing south to combat the huge breakthrough in the Confederate line. It was impossible to hold out much longer, despite Hardee's success on the Army's right. He instructed his division commanders to hold out until darkness and fall back in good order. The Army of Tennessee marched in pieces to Dalton, Georgia. Along the way, General St. John Liddell, fresh off a leave of absence, joined the retreating rebels. He found Hardee and Bragg, writing, "Hardee and Bragg came along and stopped a while to talk with me. The latter was so much depressed that I had not an unkind word at hand to reproach him for such unmitigated follies as he had gone into at Mission Ridge. He had been simply infatuated. As to Hardee, a soldier by education and nature, he was hardened to disasters, bore all with his usual cheerful philosophy." Hardee gained great praise from Bragg for his conduct at Missionary Ridge. Hardee expressed to friends and others that he was less responsible for the success on the Confederate right than his division commanders, like Cleburne and Cheatham, with Cleburne gaining some of the best accolades for his stand at Missionary Ridge and at Ringgold Gap. The humble Hardee made sure his subordinates got their just praise for their performances. On December 2, 1863, following Bragg being removed as commander of the Army of Tennessee, Hardee assumed command, but only conditionally and only temporarily. He wrote, "I fully appreciate the compliment paid to me by the President in this expression of his confidence, but feeling my inability to serve the country successfully in this new sphere of duty, I respectfully decline the command if designed to be permanent. In doing so, permit me to add that I am desirous to serve the cause in the country and will cooperate cordially with any officer the President may select." He wrote to his new command, although temporary, that "I desire to say in assuming command that there is no cause for discouragement. The overwhelming numbers of the enemy forced us back from Missionary Ridge, but the army is still intact and in good heart. Our losses were small and will be rapidly replaced. The country is looking to you with painful interest. I feel that it can rely upon you. Only the weak and the timid need to be cheered by constant success. The veterans of Shiloh, Perryville, Murfreesboro, and Chickamauga require no such stimulus to sustain their courage and resolution. Let the past take care of itself. We can and must secure the future." For 3 weeks, Hardee was the Army's commander, and he set about reinvigorating the ranks and preparing for a possible advance by Grant. He fortified Rocky Face Ridge and Crow's Valley outside Dalton, Georgia, placed cavalry on both flanks, some as far as Lafayette, to give him adequate word that a Federal movement was underway, but no advance came. Grant dispersed his troops for the moment, some being sent to Mississippi and others to East Tennessee. Within 3 weeks, Hardee was notified that the Confederate President named Joseph E. Johnston as the new permanent commander of the Army. Why Hardee refused permanent command has been and continues to be debated, but there are most likely 4 factors that led to Hardee declining. 1. He had a high regard for Johnston. 2. Johnston outranked him, and Hardee knew that Johnston should be asked first. 3. Johnston's popularity throughout the South would allow the Army to get better support. 4. Johnston came to the Army without the failures of the Army attached to himself. Hardee, although he performed well, was associated with the defeats the Army of Tennessee suffered. Hardee possessed a lack of self-confidence that he admitted, saying that he didn't feel he was up to commanding an army and felt more comfortable as a corps commander, and that he could serve the country better in that role. In late 1863, Hardee had another role on his mind, that of husband. Miss Mary Lewis, whom he met in September 1863 in Demopolis, Alabama, was still on his mind, and he visited her as much as possible. They were engaged to be married, and the secret was out. Mary was a thin woman with black hair and brown eyes, and she fell for Hardee in the form of hero worship. It was said she could never have married a man who could not be put on a pedestal. Mary was born in Alabama at her father's plantation, but moved to North Carolina with her mother when her mother became sick to stay with her family. When her mother passed, Mary stayed in North Carolina, and her father traveled back and forth between the 2 states to see Mary while she lived with her aunt and uncle. She went to Germany and France to study and returned to the United States, living with her brother and his wife on their father's plantation in Alabama after their father's death. Mary and William were to be married on January 13, 1864, at one of her family's plantations known as the Bleak House. Hardee traveled from Dalton with his best man, Patrick Claiborne, in tow. This was the first time that Claiborne had taken a leave of absence since entering the war. The wedding almost met with disaster before it ever started. Mary had traveled to Mobile for wedding supplies, and on the return trip, her steamboat struck something in the river, capsizing the vessel, with her trapped in the cabin. A crewman rescued her, and she stayed on the riverbank next to a fire to warm herself until another boat came by. She gave the gold watch she bought as a wedding gift for Hardee to the man who rescued her as a thank you. After the elegant wedding, the couple traveled to Savannah, Georgia, then to Dalton so Hardee could resume his duties as corps commander. Joining him as the other corps commander in the Army would be John Bell Hood, since Breckinridge left the Army of Tennessee for duties elsewhere. In late February, the Confederacy got a scare as William T. Sherman moved out from Vicksburg with his eyes on Meridian, Mississippi. All that stood in his way was the divisions of Leonidas Polk, who commanded that state. As Sherman pushed eastward, President Davis called on Johnston to dispatch troops to Polk's aid. Johnston responded that by the time Hardee's corps made it to Polk, it would be too late. The president then issued a direct order to Hardee to move his troops to Polk. Hardee did so, but by the time he got to Montgomery, he found that Johnston was right. He was too late to really assist Polk. But with Hardee's numbers, Polk thought he might launch an offensive. But before he could, Sherman began pulling away. Hardee then returned to Dalton and the Army of Tennessee. Mary made a home of Hardee's headquarters, with the two enjoying a couple of months together, until in early May, Johnston announced that it was time for the ladies to leave the camp, as a major campaign was imminent. Mary said goodbye to Hardee, and Hardee prepared his men outside of Dalton for the advance of three Union armies, the armies of the Cumberland, the Tennessee, and the Ohio, all under the command of one man, William T. Sherman.